My great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for two very interesting guests. It's not often that we get a husband-wife team with credentials like the guests that you'll meet in a few minutes. So welcome to the Foreign Policy Lecture Series for 2009. I want to welcome back some of the students. We had a few back last week, and I think we have a few more back this week. I'm not sure, did we ever get the high school students back, or did they leave after few times? Are there any high school students up there? I think we scared them off. But to all the rest, was that a hand? You're one? Good. Welcome. Bring your buddies back next time. The membership desk will be open after tonight's presentation, and I want to make you aware that the two guests tonight are authors of an excellent book that has gotten very favorable reviews. The title of the book is Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, a part of which you'll learn tonight, and it will no longer be untold, but this is the real thing. Important news is there are copies of the book that are available for signing after tonight's presentation. If you have cell phones, please remember to turn those off. Where did Dixie go? Is she still in the audience somewhere? Dixie, do you know anything about, it's a little embarrassing to do this way, but it was all last minute. Do we have an evening sponsor you'd like me to recognize?
Yes, it's Dr. Farouk Kidway. It's our board member, Yasmin Kidway, and her husband, Farouk.
Good. Could you stand and be recognized? That's great.
And there's someone else in the audience we'd like to introduce. We're very happy to have him here with us this evening because we are sharing the Paul Rickford Lecture with Kendall next week. But Dr. Oliver Evans, the president of Kendall College of Art and Design, is with us this evening.
And, of course, I want to thank our series speaker, which is Wolverine Worldwide, maker of great shoe footwear, including Merrell and Patagonia. They really have good stuff, so support your local manufacturer and buy some nice shoes for yourself. Once again tonight we'll have a microphone. If you raise your hand, if you have a question, we will try to get the microphone to you. If it's taking too long or if it's impossible to get it to, you may of course shout out a question and the speakers will repeat it for everybody else. But our preference would be that you wait for the microphone to get to you, and then if you picture yourself with a cigarette in your mouth, speak into the microphone and everybody can hear you. With that, it is my great honor to introduce tonight's distinguished speakers, the husband and wife team of Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. You have in your program good information about them. They are the co-producers of a 1981 PBS documentary called Afghanistan Between the Wars. 1981. This is before, for some of us, Afghanistan was really on the radar. And authors of their latest work, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. Their long involvement with Afghanistan has led them to understand that there have been several important mistakes, perhaps beginning with Great Britain's 1947 creation of an arbitrary border. At any rate, you will likely hear a very different version of events surrounding Afghanistan than you have heard previously. Please give a warm West Michigan welcome to Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould.
Thank you very much, John. Elizabeth and I would like to thank the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and all the wonderful people who've made us feel so at home in such a short period of time. Is this okay? No, this is not okay.
Is it the mic? Where is the mic?
The mic is right at my tie. Are we okay now?
It's very sensitive.
Okay. I guess this is for something else. So I'll start over again. Anyway, Elizabeth and I are very pleased to be here this evening, and we're very thankful to the people who have hosted us here and the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, who've made us feel very much at home in a very short period of time. I'm beginning to think there's something very magic about Western Michigan. I can say without a doubt this evening that the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan is the best World Affairs Council in the nation. So that's my unqualified opinion. We've come here this evening to talk about Afghanistan, how we got there, what it means to the United States, what we should be prepared for in the months and years ahead. We've also come here to offer you what's been described by Selig Harrison as a much-needed corrective to 5 decades of biased journalistic and academic writing that has covered up the destructive and self-defeating U.S. role there. So before we talk about the future, we have to establish some facts about the past that will help you understand where we are today. Over the last 30 years, Afghanistan has been at the center of a controlled campaign of both misinformation and disinformation. As the ground zero for Cold War confrontation in the 1980s, a certain amount of propaganda was to be expected, but the degree of disinformation and faulty assumptions built up around Afghanistan for much of the latter half of the 20th century continues to undermine any and all efforts to find a viable solution to or even understand the current crisis. As we know, the Soviet Union did not survive its attempts to justify its invasion of Afghanistan. Instead of assuring the Soviet people of its military prowess, Afghanistan exposed the Kremlin to its own internal contradiction and led to its eventual collapse. But neither has the United States faced up to its own false mythology created during the Reagan era, nor has it dealt seriously with the consequences of its role in the covert jihad, which claimed the lives of 2 million Afghans while fueling Muslim extremism across a broad swath of South and Central Asia. For their own reasons, both the American political system and the American media reveled in this process. But it was a campaign that shaped an erroneous two-dimensional worldview of that struggle. While suiting American Cold War foreign policy goals, this carefully crafted but fantasy Afghanistan, especially in the case of something like Charlie Wilson's war, now leaves the American people and the United States government itself at a loss for what to do. I had hoped that by now the history of the American campaign to lure the Soviet Union into its own Vietnam and Afghanistan and bleed them there would have become common knowledge. I had hoped that after nearly 8 years of U.S. and NATO occupation, a deeper and more reflective approach to the complex workings of Afghan society and its role in history might have emerged. But the delusions of the past die hard. Just last month, a Boston Globe columnist reminded me that those Cold War fantasies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s were still out there. Quote, "It wasn't until the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, he wrote, that Carter finally woke up to his naivete. Carter's failure to understand the threat posed by the Soviet Empire had costly consequences for America and the world. Will that pattern be repeated with Barack Obama in the threat from radical Islam?" As the host of a weekly public affairs program on Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network affiliate in Boston in 1979, I was very familiar with this kind of Cold War scare tactic. It was my obligation to balance the extreme conservative apocalypse is coming programming that streamed from the network. So when Robertson aired the Anti-Strategic Arms Limitation Talks documentary, The SALT Syndrome, as a public service message, it gave us the opportunity to take on the nuclear arms race. In the summer of 1979, we began production of a documentary called The Arms Race and the Economy, A Delicate Balance. During the next months, numerous experts, including John Kenneth Galbraith, lent their experience to our understanding of the unseen damage that abandoning detente would represent to our civilian economy. We learned that the arms race wasn't just about defending the United States. The arms race was a dark world of big business, exotic science, and backroom politics, ruled over by a self-described priesthood of experts. Galbraith insisted that bringing back the Cold War would ultimately destroy the American economy by redirecting American money and purpose away from rebuilding its infrastructure and its industrial base. That fall in Washington, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency was one of the last holdouts of sanity as neoconservative accusations about American security grew hysterical. Was the Soviet Union really planning a sneak attack on the United States with nuclear weapons, as they claimed? Was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty really just a public relations scheme by Moscow to put us off our guard? In hindsight, we know that these claims were untrue. The Soviet Union was dying, driven to salt by its weakness and not its strength. But when the Soviets crossed their southern border into Afghanistan, it played out on America's TV screens like a World War II Hollywood movie. Hardly a soul realized that a trap had been set to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, and the Soviets had taken the bait. But no one was supposed to know that. Instead, a crop of conservative experts appeared on the scene claiming that the Soviets were running out of oil and using Afghanistan as a staging ground to conquer the Middle East. By the time our program aired that winter, the argument was no longer whether our government should call a halt to the nuclear arms race and reinvest in the civilian economy. The Carter administration had rebranded itself as a Cold War fighting machine, flown back to 1947, with the debate refocused not on whether, but on how much was to be spent on the Cold War. Our decision in the fall of 1980 to request permission from the Afghan government to enter Afghanistan and see for ourselves what the Soviets were up to grew from the startling chain of events. Our journey there in the spring of 1981 under contract to CBS News would forever immunize us from the haze of Reagan-era propaganda. Afghanistan was a progressive third world nation trying to pull itself into the 20th century. Since 1973, it had been the object of a covert attack from Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, with the intention of overthrowing its government and replacing it with one headed by Islamic extremists. A 1978 coup had toppled that government and replaced it with a narrowly based, nominally Marxist-oriented group called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, who found themselves, according to one declassified U.S. cable that we came across, at the mercy of an anti-Soviet, quote, Chinese, Iranian, Pakistani, Arabian Peninsula axis with U.S. support, end of quote. I'll repeat that. The Marxists found themselves at the mercy of a Chinese, Iranian, Pakistani, Arabian Peninsula axis with U.S. support. Far from the simplistic picture of good versus evil portrayed by the American media, ethnic feuding, modernization, women's rights, a 50% infant mortality rate, and Islamic extremism fueled by chronic poverty were all factors in the country's instability. The governments of the United States, the People's Republic of China, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan were training rebels to burn down schools and factories, knock down power lines, and generally destabilize the southern border of the Soviet Union. All this against a backdrop of 200 years of colonial pressure from Russia and Britain that saw Britain's armies occupy Afghanistan on 3 separate occasions. But this was something that you, the American public, were not to know. CBS News ran a story about our trip a month after our return. But instead of focusing on the effects of the terrorist war being waged from Pakistan, the CBS brass chose to focus on Soviet invaders that we never saw. In the words of Alvin Snyder, former director of the United States Information Agency's Worldwide Television and Film Service, in his 1995 book Warriors of Disinformation, quote, "The war in Afghanistan was the American government's made-for-TV movie. It was a war in which media coverage was purchased from a mail-order catalog, and Uncle Sam owned the warehouse. Afghanistan was a public relations nightmare for Moscow, but a public relations dream come true for Washington." End of quote. Given the threat to world peace that the Soviet presence in Afghanistan represented at that time, we decided to challenge the public relations campaign coming from President Ronald Reagan's Washington, and Liz will now tell you what we discovered.
The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan continued to raise serious questions that nobody in the mainstream...
Can't hear.
Sorry. Okay.
It's all right. We need to turn it up.
Oh, this?
No, that's fine. Can you turn up the Liz's mic?
Is that good? Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Sorry. It doesn't sound any different to me up here. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan continued to raise serious doubts that nobody in the mainstream media was asking about. It was as if something invisible was driving the conflict, and we were determined to find out what it was. Against this backdrop, we put together a trip in 1983 with Harvard Negotiation Project Director Roger Fisher for ABC Nightline that revealed a stunning revelation. Far from being the first step towards the Persian Gulf, the Soviet Union was anxious to get out. The chief Soviet Afghan specialist told Roger point blank, quote, "Give us 6 months to save face and we'll leave the Afghans to solve their own problems. We make mistakes, but we're not stupid. We want to go home. End of quote. When we returned from Kabul with this story, however, we were greeted with blank stares. It appeared our perspective from the Afghan front made the life complicated for the Nightline staff. Rejected as a news story by ABC World News Tonight, we were granted one Thursday evening after midnight to make the case for a Soviet withdrawal. Roger laid out the facts. Since neither the Soviets nor the Mujahideen could win, thus creating a stalemate, it was in the interest of the United States to accept the Soviet offer that once the insurgency flowing from Pakistan stopped, the Soviets would go home. But the cards were stacked against Roger. Ted Koppel directed the discussion away from Roger's first-hand observations towards the opinions of Soviet dissident Vladimir BUKOVSKY. While painting the Soviets as so driven to seize Middle East oil that they could never stop, BUKOVSKY pronounced that there was no possibility of negotiating the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And then Koppel introduced Abdul Rahim, a political officer of Jamiat Islami. Koppel described Rahim's sponsors as, quote, two American organizations concerned with democracy in Afghanistan, the Afghan Relief Committee and Freedom House, end of quote. Had there been any concern about democracy in Afghanistan, the Jamiat Islami would never have been chosen by the Afghan Relief Committee or Freedom House. Rather than promoting democracy, it promoted the strictest interpretation of Islamic law as a replacement for Western-style democracy. Sponsored by a right-wing Pakistani, Saudi, and Arab interests throughout the 1970s, it destroyed the democratic political interests in Pakistan and then solidified its dominance through the dictatorship of Zia-ul-Haq, who was also Congressman Charlie Wilson's conduit for U.S. aid to the Mujahideen. And as it turned out, it was Wilson's success at getting increased funding and high-tech weapons to the Mujahideen that kept the insurgency going, and that kept the Soviets in Afghanistan for another 6 years. The way Ted Koppel framed this story left the impression that there was no possibility of negotiating the Soviets out of Afghanistan. As with the CBS News report, we had come up against the official wisdom on the Afghan story, which we were informed by Major Karen McKay of the Committee for a Free Afghanistan was simply this: we don't need proof to convict the Soviet Union. We know they're guilty. Over the years, as we continued to watch efforts to negotiate a peace in Afghanistan overruled by invisible forces that continued to promote a campaign of disinformation that kept Americans in the dark, we kept searching for answers. It wasn't until Robert Gates' 1997 book, From the Shadows, did the genuine American role begin to emerge publicly. Quoting from a memo sent by CIA Director Stansfield Turner to President Carter on January 16, 1980, just weeks after the Soviet invasion, Turner wrote, quote, "It's unlikely that the Soviet occupation is a pre-planned first step to the implementation of a grand design for the rapid establishment of hegemonic control over all of South Asia. The occupation may have been a reluctantly authorized response to what was perceived by the Kremlin as an imminent and irreversible deterioration of its already established position in a country within the Soviets' legitimate sphere of influence," end of quote. And an interview in 1998 by President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, confirmed what we had suspected all along. Quote, "According to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began after the Soviet Army invaded Afghanistan, December 27, 1979. But the reality is completely otherwise. It was July 3, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for the secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime. This aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention, drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War," end of quote. And then in 1999, we got a very personal view from someone inside Congress who was in Congress from 76 throughout the entire Afghan operation. Pennsylvania Congressman Don Ritter confirmed to us that increased funding to the Mujahideen was intended to keep the Soviets bogged down in Afghanistan. In our conversation with Don, we brought up the missed opportunity to negotiate the Soviets out of Afghanistan that we had discovered in 1983, and Don responded without hesitation. Yes, the Soviets wanted to get out, but we couldn't let them out. We had to hold them down and destroy them there. It is ironic that the election of President Carter in 1976 was built on the hope that the end of the Cold War was near. But by authorizing the covert operation that lured the Soviets into Afghanistan, the Carter administration set the stage for a devastating conflict that is now entering its fourth decade. Our Nightline experience revealed how the conceptual framework of Cold War journalism maintained the childlike Reagan-era good versus evil illusion when the facts on the ground cried out for a fresh approach. The truth is that the Reagan defense buildup rested on the false claim that the Soviets were running out of oil and Afghanistan was the first step in their drive for the Middle East. By 1983, that claim had become sacred wisdom. The failure of the American media to challenge the underlying assumptions of covert action in Afghanistan not only provided the unquestioned increases in defense spending, it prolonged the war for another 6 years, and it made 9/11 and the crisis in Afghanistan today inevitable. In 2002, we went to film Afghan human rights expert Seema Wali for her first return in exile since 1978. While there, we found that 75% of Kabul was still in ruins when the U.S.-backed Mujahideen turned their weapons on the Afghan people from 1992 to 1996. But on our return home, we got an even greater shock. When the customs agent realized that we had been filming in Kabul, he asked to inspect our tapes for pictures of American troops. And as he decided what to do, we recalled our last day in Kabul in 1983 was spent protecting our tapes from an Afghan censor whose job was to blacken any Soviet images. And now a U.S. customs agent had changed places with a state censor deciding what images America could see and what images American couldn't. In 1983, when the Marxist official threatened to confiscate our tapes unless we allowed him to censor them, we used our belief in the freedom of the press to challenge his authority. But that freedom is threatened today in ways we don't even know. In 1979, the Soviet Union and the United States faced a crossroads in Afghanistan that has delivered us here today. It's critical that the record be set straight by the media itself on the U.S. role in that deliverance. And in that effort, we now would like to present to you the CBS News report and the ABC Nightline so you can see for yourself how the story was framed.
In Afghanistan, rebel attacks on Soviet and Soviet-led local military forces appear to have increased during the past several weeks. This, at least, is what various diplomatic sources in India and Pakistan and refugees have told CBS News. For the first time in months, there also are new reports of the Soviets using gas against the rebels. What kind of gas is unclear. The Russians vehemently deny they ever have used gas. Shortly before these reports, the Soviet-supported Afghan government authorized an independent American film team to visit the country. CBS News correspondent Steve Young, recently returned from Moscow, put the American film together with Soviet propaganda film for this report.
The truth of the April Revolution. In this film, we show everything as it actually is.
This film, made by Soviets for Soviets, does not show the Afghan guerrillas resisting the Soviet-installed regime in their country. But the film did provide one of the few glimpses of life in Afghanistan city since the Soviet invasion, until an American TV crew was allowed in, the first American journalists to be officially welcomed in 16 months.
It is not as active and as volatile as we expected it to be. Perhaps we hit it on 10 good days. Perhaps the reason why they granted us the permission to come when they did was the feeling that they had reached a level of security where they could allow an American team in.
The Afghanistan that Paul Fitzgerald and his crew saw last month was much the same view the Soviets have been showing their own people. In Kabul, the capital, people seem to be going about business as usual. Not a Russian face in sight.
You see instances of modern technology roar by you on the street, while simultaneously you see someone doing business who has probably not changed his family business or the way in which he does it for the last 2,000 years. And that's what gives you the feeling that, through all this, and whatever your observations are, that somehow there is this sense of normalcy that is going on simultaneously.
Soviet troops came here to protect the peaceful life of Afghan children.
According to the official Kremlin line, the Soviets did not invade Afghanistan, but were invited in to help ward off outside aggression. Never without government escort were the Americans free to ask what people really thought. All the Afghans the Americans were allowed to talk to praised the presence of the Soviet troops, particularly President BABRAK KARMAL.
The very assistance that had been rendered to the Afghan people by the Soviet Union had been done so on the basis of the good neighborliness, cooperation, and friendship between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union.
These soldiers, our boys, protect this land bravely and selflessly.
But despite all the official claims that Afghanistan wants the Russians around, Soviet soldiers and war machines shown in the Soviet footage were strictly off limits to the American team.
We were shooting across the road when we were visiting a farm, and when we saw the armored personnel carrier, my cameraman just happened to move his camera slightly towards it as it roared by, and it evoked an immediate reaction from our hosts. They just more or less surrounded the cameraman and said, that's got to go. You shouldn't have done that.
The Americans weren't supposed to take these pictures either. Russian transports at one airport and at another, more than 125 Soviet helicopters. Most Soviet troops are bivouacked at the airports. They move into the cities at night.
4 o'clock in the afternoon, the winds roll in, the dust comes off the mountains, the smell of charcoal is in the air, the sun goes down, and the moon comes up on a clear Kabul night. You can begin to hear the whine of armored personnel carriers roaring through the city at about 45 miles an hour.
Carefully controlled by authorities, the Americans were allowed to see 2 cities, Kabul and Jalalabad. By day, they seemed secure, but in the countryside, it became apparent the image was an illusion.
We were escorted by 2 armored personnel carriers and a truck full of local militia, who, when we got there, established a perimeter and a point around the area that we were to view. Helicopters would suddenly appear off in the distance, patrolling the area that we were in. After 10 days, you get used to seeing people standing around with machine guns on their shoulders.
There will doubtlessly be many more gunshots.
The Soviets say they are winning the war and the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. But the sharp constraints placed by authorities on the American journalists, where they could go, what they could see, suggests resistance against the regime in Kabul may be far greater than the Russians are willing to admit. Steve Young, CBS News, New York.
مردم امریکا جلوی تحریکات و تجاوزات امپریالیسم امریکا را بگیرند و اراده اصیل و واقعی مردم امریکا با سرنوشت امریکا مسلط شود و در جهان از صلح و آزادی دفاع کند.
No, resolutely no.
اصول و پروگرام و اهداف جمهوری دموکراتیک افغانستان با اسلام مترقی کاملا مطابقت. Not American Islam.
مستحق د جنتو کېدلای شي د نعمتو کېدلای شي چې د کوشش ونه کړي. نو په دنیا او آخرت کې د الله دا قانون دی چې په خپل لاس کوشش وکړه د هغه محصول وخوره. نو زه چې د حکومت هغه اصول ما مطالعه کړي دي د دغه الله د کتاب سره زما په خیال ډېر موافق راځي. نو داسې شی زما په خیال نه جوماتونو خو اکثره د محله چې هغه ځای کې مسجد جوړیږي نه وي، هغه مسجد خو هغه محله ده کې بیا ریاست شؤون اسلامي د دې پیسې داسې یي که فرضاً خلک پشکې ناکام راغله بیا کومک ورسره کوي.
निकलता
They can stand there and I'll come over.
سلام. تقریبا یک ماه پیش بود و در حدود 100-1.5 نفر بودن. طور کنم خساره قابل تذکر باشه. بار ناوردن تنها یک دروازه رئیس صندوق رئیس جرگه ماره. اونمو را از بین بردن براکت.
Who were these rebels? Did he know any of them?
آیا شما از یشورا کدام تایش میشناسین؟
ما در اینجا اکثر میشناسیم به خاطر از اینکه از ایده و قریه تقریبا رفتن و فعلا در پاکستان زندگی میکنن و از اونجا با گروپای دیگه میاین اینجا و سر از این قریه حمله میخوانن و در یک مکتب هم هناست. هدفشان این بود که اون مکاتب بسازانن و اینجا به سلام جریان نرمال تعلیم و تربیت را مختل بسازن.
یعنی که تشریح میدونه.
تفنگ جسی امریکایی
American made American made machine guns.
تفنگ کلت
شان
راکت 83 میلیمتری کومولتیف ضد تانک امریکایی.
Cumulative American made 83 millimeter rocket.
یا امریکایی است.
These are American made mines.
SH-55 ساختن.
SH-55.
یا انگلیسی است.
These are British made.
یا مصری است.
Egyptian.
یا چینی است.
Chinese made.
هر وقتی که تضمین مطمئن و موثق از طرف کشورهای همجار پاکستان و ایران، امریکا و چین و افغانستان داده شود که دیگر هیچ گونه مداخله و تجاوز و تحریکات و مداخلات در امور داخلی افغانها صورت نمیگیرد، در آن صورت قطعات محدود اتحاد شوروی به کشور سرجوی خود عودت می کند. در غیر آن هرگاه این نوع تهدیدات و مداخلات در امور داخلی افغانستان، تجاوزات و تحریکات از طرف کشورهای همجار بخصوص پاکستان علیه افغانستان انقلابی صورت بگیره قطعات محدود ایجاد شده‌ای در افغانستان باقی خواهند موند.
The question is this: after more than 3 years of stalemate in Afghanistan, is there any prospect now for a negotiated settlement and the withdrawal of Soviet troops? With us now to discuss that question from our Boston bureau, Roger Fisher, director of the Harvard Negotiation Project, a leading expert on crisis negotiations, whom we've just seen during his visit to Afghanistan earlier this month. And in our San Francisco bureau, Vladimir BUKOVSKY, a Soviet emigre now studying at Stanford. He is helping to coordinate Radio Free Kabul, an organization in the West devoted to getting news and information tapes into Marxist-controlled Afghanistan. Roger Fisher, let me begin with you and ask you whether you accept, in fact, the characterization of a stalemate in Afghanistan from your own observations.
Well, it's pretty bloody for a stalemate. That is, the Soviet forces and the Afghan forces are bombing, in fact, in Herat, if the stories are to be believed, destroying some villages. And the resistance is fighting fairly hard. But it's certainly true that neither side has a chance for a military victory. There's no chance the Soviet forces, at least for several years, could bring the resistance to a dead stop. And I see no possibility that the resistance could overthrow or defeat the Soviet army. So militarily, there's no chance of military victory either side.
And what chance do you believe there is for a negotiated settlement? What is it that causes you to believe that something that would have been totally unacceptable to the Soviets 3 years ago would be acceptable to them now?
Well, there are several costs they have. They have the cost of casualties. They have the cost of perhaps $2 or $3 billion a year worth of costs of keeping it there. And they have the very high international cost around the world of having Soviet helicopter gunships shooting down a nationalist resistance movement. Everywhere in the third world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Soviet Union is having a hard time explaining that a treaty of friendship results in this kind of action. That's a high cost.
Vladimir Bukovsky, do you believe that that kind of a cost to the Soviet Union is the sort of thing that would ever cause them to withdraw?
No, I don't believe in that. In fact, unlike the United States, the Soviet Union is not very sort of apprehensive of the casualties. They probably lost about 20,000 by now, but they wouldn't give any consideration to it. What is important for them is the strategic advantage of their moving toward the Persian Gulf. And to all accounts we have right now, they do keep in certain bases inside the equipment, the planes, capable to project force into the Persian Gulf.
We're really talking about two different things here, though, Mr. Bukovsky. The one would be the cost at home, and I think I'd have to agree with you that they're not very much concerned about public opinion in that regard. But what about the point that Professor Fisher raised, and that is how they are perceived by the rest of the third world?
Well, before moving to Afghanistan 3.5 years ago, they've, of course, considered this course, and it wasn't unexpected to them. Also, for 3 years, they had been under the pressure on that subject, and that's exactly why now they try to persuade people that they are ready to withdraw if they're given a chance to save the face, which is not true. To all accounts we have from that country, the Soviets have no intention of withdrawing.
What is it that you hope to accomplish with Radio Free Kabul?
Well, our project was generated 2 years ago in Paris, in France, when we launched an appeal, a public appeal to the people to raise money and to supply Afghans with portable radios capable of broadcasting uncensored news and commentary to the people of this country, where the media was totally under the Soviet control by that time. Then we had been joined by public groups in Great Britain and some public groups in the United States in this appeal. There are small but very active groups in Portland, Oregon, called American Aid to Afghans, and the Committee for Free Afghanistan in Washington, D.C. All of them are very energetic and most helpful for this thing. We provide these portable transmitters to the Mujahideen, to the freedom fighters, together with